Suicide and Forgiveness, the pod that shares the stories of those affected by suicide. Lost a loved one? Attempted it yourself? Did you know that when you share a burden, the load is lightened? Come listen in with your host, Elaine Lindsay.
Suicide Zen Forgiveness, the podcast, is for education only. Some of the subject matter could be triggering for those that are newly grieving or in a poor state of mental health. Please call your local suicide hotline or mental health office if you need immediate help. Hello. It's great to be back with you today. Here on Suicide Zen Forgiveness, as you know, we have branched out somewhat to take in a little more of mental health and your wellness and addictions and all that sort of goes along with that. Having said that, today our story comes from my guest, Patrick Chester. Patrick is a husband and father of two boys. And he has a really interesting story to do with gambling addiction. In fact, he now works in that very arena, but we're going to get that from his lips. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Patrick up. Hi, Patrick.
Elaine, how you doing? Thanks for having me on today. Really looking forward to this.
Well, I'm so happy to have you here, and I'm actually really looking forward to hearing your story because, like a lot of the guests that we have on, the outcome is very positive, and that for me is what's really important. I want us to be able to show people that there is light at the end of any dark tunnel and never to give up hope.
Yeah, and that's so true. You know, we can all find ourselves in dark places at times in life, right? And how do we get through that? You know, and as we can get into with kind of my situation and my journey through gambling addiction, oftentimes for the addict and for people with mental health struggles and issues, when we go over to the dark side, it's hard to see a way out of that, right? And so fortunately for me, I was able to find the light and get through that, but many people don't. And so hopefully we can shed a little light on that today as we kind of talk through some of my story.
Oh, that's excellent. That's really where I want to go. And with that in mind, my first question to you is, as a child, were you likely to basically gamble on what you did, or whether you'd win, or whether you and your friends could do something before somebody else? Was it always a part of your makeup, or was it something that came later?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's a really good question. For me, I grew up in and around sports. I played sports my whole life, and so I always had that. Competitive fire in me, you know. And so with my friends as a child, sure, it was always about winning or being faster than the guy next to me, or scoring more points in a basketball game. So it was always about competition. Okay. And that, I think, you know, as we get further down the road here in a minute or two, I think played a part in what became a raging gambling addiction as I got into my 20s and 30s.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to bring it out, because I found in research and other things that I've done over the years, people that are super competitive, people that are into sports, and I was as well, or are very academic, tend to go one of two ways. They will either fall into a path of gambling, whether it gets beyond them is another thing, or they will stay so far away from gambling. It's like there's a wall up. So when did you place your first actual bet?
Yeah, that's My first real bet was when I was about 19 years old. I was working up in Alaska at the time with some friends, and we started playing cards. We were playing poker and that sort of thing. And I was 19, 20 years old, and the bets were small. I didn't have a lot of money when I was 19 and 20 years old. So, I may have had $20 to sit down at a card table with a bunch of friends. Right. And so we would do that fairly regularly, and I didn't see a problem at the time. But, if we go back just a little bit, growing up as a child around my father was he was a gambler and a drinker. And so I was introduced to gambling at a very young age.
Okay.
And never, in fact, my father encouraged it. I think he handed me $5 or $10 when I was 8 or 9 years old, and, put me in front of his friend's slot machine. His friend had a slot machine in his house, and so I didn't have any sort of concept or perspective when it came to gambling. It was just portrayed as something that was fun and harmless. And so, as I started playing cards in my late teens, early 20s, I had no idea of what gambling could do, and that it was actually could become an addiction like drugs or alcohol. I just didn't know.
Wow, that's incredible to think that you were sort of introduced to a slot machine as a child. I'm a Brit, and in Scotland, bookies were as plentiful as chip shops and bars. And even my dad would run to the bookie for his grandmother. It was the done thing. I mean, that's what you did. You bet on the horses, or you bet on whatever. So it's interesting to know that it was part of, for me, working class culture.
Yes, for sure. In many respects, it's gambling, at least in the U.S., is considered respectable. And a lot of people don't view it as anything other than entertainment, right? And something fun you could do is with a family, and we're introducing our kids to it at very young ages.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as we can kind of get into in my 20s and 30s, I kind of crossed over to the dark side, which we can touch on. But yeah, it's in the UK, for example, I do a lot of work with people over in the UK, and they've been betting, as they've been betting on sports over there legally for a lot longer than we have in the States. And and they're really seeing the dark side of that now with suicides and everything else, and mental health struggles. And over here in the States, we're fairly new to this. It's just become legal to bet on sports in the last 3 or 4 years in many states here. And so we have no concept as a society, no idea what can happen.
Mm-hmm.
I unfortunately do. So it's we're kind of at the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. So in your early 20s, when you started gambling, would you say there were a lot of wins, or there weren't enough wins?
There were, that's the thing about gambling is you don't lose all the time. You do win sometimes, and that's how you can get sucked into it, and for somebody that's susceptible or prone to addiction, addiction runs in families.
Yeah.
And it ran in my family. I was the first to have a gambling addiction. My father was a gambler, like I said, but he was more of a raging alcoholic than he was a gambler. But so the wins sucked me in. But then what began to happen in my 20s, late 20s, was that $100 bets soon became $1,000 bets, and I started taking money that I should have been using to pay bills and pay rent, and gambling with that money, because in my mind, I was thinking, well, I'm just going to win, and I'm going to double up that money, and then I can pay my bills, and then I'll have extra money. And so you get into this cycle. I began to get into the cycle in my late 20s where I started making really bad choices, and again, using money that I shouldn't have been on gambling. And you never, any gambler that tells you that they win more than they lose over the long haul is just not being honest. Because if you continue to gamble, you're going to eventually lose. And that's what happened. And so I got started to fall behind and chasing bets. I started chasing one bad bet after another. And yeah, occasionally I would win. But when I did, I would just double that up until I lost. And that's the cycle I got into, and this would have been around, this would have been probably around, the late 90s, early 2000s, when all of that started to happen. And with addiction, it's many people don't understand gambling addiction. They just view it as a choice, right? You're just looking at somebody with gambling addiction and they think, well, why don't you just stop? What they don't understand is the process in the brain is very similar to drug addiction or alcoholism, and with the dopamine and how all that works in the brain. And so I didn't have a shutoff valve with my gambling. So I would gamble with friends, and it was primarily on sporting. We would bet on football games and basketball games, and my friends could lose a bet and stop. If I lost, I had to keep going. I just couldn't. There was no shutoff valve for me. You know what I mean? So as we kind of get into the early 2000s, that's what was starting to happen behind the scenes, right? Nobody really knew.
Yeah.
People knew that I gambled, my friends, but they didn't know to the extent to which I had gone, and as gamblers, we're really creative when we can hide it, because you don't necessarily see the physical effects on a gambling addict that you do with with an alcoholic or drug addict. Yeah. So people may see weird behaviors or notice red flags, but they're just not sure what's going on with you, because you don't show those signs.
Oh, those red flags are much more subtle.
They're much more subtle, because you don't, again, if you have a friend or family member that's a full-blown drug addict, you could see that on them.
Oh, absolutely.
And an alcoholic, you can see that on them. But with a gambling addict, there are no outward signs. It's just weird stuff going on and weird stories. And we become, as gambling addicts, we become professional liars to a point, where we're not, because we like to deceive people, but we're trying to cover up what's going on. And so it's all of these behaviors and stories and lies and things that don't add up. And so that's kind of where I was at, like I say, around kind of my late 20s, early 30s.
It's interesting that you word it that way, stories and cover-ups, because I believe in the gambler's mind, you're not thinking, oh my God, I'm lying to people. You're thinking, okay, well, I just need this story for now till I win and I can pay everything off, and then everything will be fine. There's that constant, well, it's only until.
That was my game. That was my MO the whole time. It was just buy myself another day, okay, with a story or something like that. Buy myself another day, because then I can hustle some money. I can gamble with it, and I'm going to win, and then I can pay this person off, and then they're happy, right? And as this is all happening, it was around kind of 2004, 2005. I began to work for myself as a contractor, and so I had clients that trusted me to do big projects for them, and they were handing over $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 checks to me as project deposits, down payments for construction projects. And so I had access to money, and to a raging gambling addict, that's a problem. And I wasn't able to, my brain was so warped at that time. Like you just mentioned, I would convince myself that if I could just put this person off for a day or two, I can cover it. I can win more money and cover it. And, I began to create this web, this circle around me of people that I owed money to, clients. And it becomes this game of chase. I'm chasing these bad bets, and I'm also running from people and avoiding them because I owe them money. And it's that started the kind of the last 10 years of my addiction were some really dark times.
Now, within that last 10 years, where does family come into this? Where does your personal life come into this? And I mean, what kind of incredible juggling act would you have to do?
It was exhausting. Yeah, that's a great question, because I did get married in 2006 to my wife, and I entered into that marriage with the best intentions, right? I wasn't going into marriage thinking I wanted to live a life of deception and fraud and all of that. But what my wife didn't know at the time was that I was already over $100,000 in debt, and I was hiding all of that, but then as we get married, obviously it becomes a partnership, and finances and everything are combined. And my wife, in the early years of our marriage, 2006, 2007, 2008, right in there, trusted me to handle our bills and the mortgage payments and those sorts of things. And she had no idea I was even gambling, okay, let alone taking clients' money and gambling with it, and over $100,000 in debt. So I began to, instead of making the mortgage payment, I was using that money to gamble with. Instead of paying our bills that she trusted me to pay, I was gambling with that money. And then when I would win, I would throw some money in the bank account, and she would see that and kind of try and play that game. And like you said, it's a juggling act. There were things like, well, there's no money in the bank, and then boom, I'd win a bet. I'd throw some money in the bank, and okay, well, things must be good again. So it's this constant juggling act that I was doing. And then our first son was born in 2009. And was an amazing thing in my life. But at the same time, my wife had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. And I'm living a lie, and walking through the door each night, looking my wife in the eye and giving her the impression that, everything's fine. Knowing in the back of my mind that no, everything wasn't fine. But we developed this ability to convince ourselves that somehow, some way, we're going to get out of that. And that was my thing. And gambling in my mind had almost become my solution, because as now I'm approaching, when our son was born in 2009, now I'm approaching almost $500,000 in debt at that point, with loans and money that I owed clients and all of these other things. And in my mind, the only way I could get out of that was to gamble more and more, and then just hit it big, right? Just hit it big, because I could convince myself that it just took that one big bet. And that never really happened.
Yeah. But that's how addiction becomes so insidious, because what you said, the addiction became, in your mind, the solution.
It did.
Not the problem.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And in my mind, it was the solution to my problem. But going back to what we talked about earlier, it's so hard. Like, for people that look at gambling addiction from the outside, they just view it as you're just making a choice. Just stop doing it.
Yeah.
And at this point, 2009, 2010, I realized that I had a major problem. But I had passed the point of no return in my mind. I couldn't come clean with it at that point, because I was convinced if I did, my wife would just divorce me, and that would be the end of it. And I would just go off into the distance and never be heard from again. But, things got a little scary there, after that, after my son was born, 2010, 11, 12, where I had all these clients that I owed money to. Some I owed $2,000 or $3,000 to, some I owed $30,000 or $40,000 to. And some of them were coming after me. Many of them reported me to the state, and then the state ultimately turned it over to the prosecutors. And I would be charged with 2 counts of first-degree theft in 2013 for money that was given to me by clients. And they had no idea that I was gambling, or all they knew was the narrative about me was that I was, a shady contractor. These people you hear about that, take people's money and hit the road. Well, that's not what I was doing at all, but that's what it looked like to them.
Yeah.
Right? And so they reported me, and I would ultimately be charged in 2013 with 2 counts of first-degree theft, which are felonies. And during that period of time, I had clients that, like I said, were looking for me, and some of them didn't want to go through the legal process. Some of them would rather just take care of it outside of that, if you know what I'm saying. And I had
Yeah.
one client threatened to send some people after me, and I just ignored it, didn't take it seriously
Ooh.
until one night. And I'll never forget this. I was home with our son would have been about 3 years old at the time. I think this was around 2012. It was in the middle of winter. It was dark. It was like 8 o'clock at night. My wife's at work. She works as a nurse, and she was working. And my little son, my 3-year-old son, is behind me playing with his train set. And I'm walking towards the front door of our house at the time. And to the left of our front door is a window, a rectangular shaped window. And there's a guy standing right in the window staring at me.
Oh my God.
And I didn't recognize this guy. But he sees me, I see him, I'm walking towards the door. There was no avoiding this. So I go to the door. I open the front door thinking it's just him. I open the front door and there's 2 other guys there. So now there's 3 guys standing there. These guys are all in their probably early 20s. And they weren't there to, this wasn't a social call. So they immediately asked for me by name, and they had never seen me personally before. They probably had a brief description of me. And they asked for me by name, and I quickly deflected and said, "No, I'm not Patrick. I'm his brother. But if you need to get a hold of him, I'm more than happy to put you in touch with him." And they bought that, and they turned around and they left. And what I came to find out later was one of those guys had a gun on him. And I don't know that he was there to shoot me or scare me or beat the hell out of me. But whatever would have happened, it would have happened in front of my 3-year-old son.
Exactly.
So that's kind of where we go. That's where this went for me. Had gone completely over to the dark side. I was now in danger. My family was in danger, and came to find out later that, in fact, my client that threatened to do that, he's the one that sent those guys after me.
Wow.
And so that's towards the end of, we're getting towards the end of my run as a gambler, but you can kind of see where this was, now gambling had become all consuming with me. And now I'm putting my family at risk because of the choices I'm making to feed my addiction.
So what was going on in your head about your son? And were you starting to weigh the possible consequences now that you saw your family in the way? Like before, it was just you and your issues, but now it's kind of you've thrown the family into the mix. Did that give you pause, or did it mess with how you were thinking?
So that was a feeling unlike anything I'd never experienced. That it's like getting kicked in the gut, right? I mean, it was a sickening feeling looking at my son after that had happened, and knowing that we're all in a bad situation now because of my problems. And so, but I couldn't. My head was so cloudy. I could not figure out a solution to this problem at this point. I mean, had I just come clean years before that and addressed it, it would have been better, but I didn't. And so I was so deep, I couldn't figure a way out of that. My thinking became, well, if I just end my life, my wife and son will be better off without me, because that's where I was at then. It was just, there was no turning back. The only way out of it was to win more money and pay everybody off. But that wasn't happening. And so my thought process was, I was getting to the point where suicide had become really my only option.
So, what steps did you ultimately take?
So what happened was that was 2012 or 2013. In 2014, this was, I guess if there was ever a rock bottom moment for me, it actually came in 2014 when didn't have the ability to work anymore. I was no longer, the state took my license, revoked my business license. There were all kinds of people that knew about me, and my name was, my reputation was trashed at that point. So I couldn't do work anymore. I had lost too many friends. I couldn't borrow money from anybody anymore. Nobody knew that I had a gambling addiction, really. They just knew that nothing made sense, and they didn't want to deal with me. So I took $9.50 from my son's piggy bank. He would have been, I think, 5 years old or 4 years old at the time. $9.50. So I took that from my son's piggy bank, and later that afternoon, I sat in my car and I stared out the window, and I was crying for what seemed like hours. And I was convinced that I was going to kill myself. I just had to figure out how I was going to do it. And so that would have been November of 2014. And that was my lowest moment there, because I didn't want to leave this world. I loved my son very much, my wife, everything. We had, I felt so bad about the situation I had put them in, that the only way to fix it was for me to be gone. And so that's where I was at. But fortunately, what happened was, 2 months later, my father-in-law, my wife's dad, received an email from a family member telling him that they thought I had a gambling problem. They didn't really know, but they thought, because they had done some research, and they thought I had a gambling problem. And so he got my wife involved. They did some research. They started making some phone calls to people that I knew, and they just kind of pieced it all together and figured out, okay, you do have a gambling problem. They had no idea of the scope, magnitude. They had no idea that I had even been charged with these 2 counts of theft.
Wow.
Which were, there was a sentencing day coming up for that.
Yeah.
That was coming up in March of 2015, but we're talking, this is 1st of February 2015 when my father-in-law found out. And so they put this intervention together and presented me with an opportunity to go off to treatment, inpatient treatment, to deal with my gambling addiction. And I accepted it, and I was grateful. That was a relief, because I no longer had to live this lie. It was, it would be months and months and months of untangling all of the webs and everything for my wife and her family. They had no idea what I had done. They just knew I had a problem. So while I was in treatment in February for a month in Minnesota for my gambling addiction, my wife and her father and her sister would delve into everything behind the scenes and figure out what I had done. They would discover that I took $28,000 from my wife's retirement account without her knowledge during that period of time to feed my addiction. Not because I enjoyed doing that. It's because I was consumed by it and sick in the head. And they would find out that I had been charged with 2 counts of theft, and that I had a sentencing date coming up in March of that year. They would find out that I had taken over $100,000 of construction equipment and sold it for $20,000. These are all the things that I did to feed my addiction. And while I'm in treatment, they're discovering all of this. And my wife had to hire 3 different attorneys. She had to hire a criminal lawyer, a divorce lawyer, and a financial lawyer, because she had no idea. I had involved her name in a lot of this stuff, and she had no idea about any of it, all of this stuff, And so basically what happened was I went off to treatment, and that I was able to clear my head and learn about what this actually was. In my mind, I entered that place. I walked into a treatment center just convinced that I was a bad person. What I would find out that I was sick.
Yeah.
And when and I also came to the realization that there are really good people that are sick with addiction.
Yeah.
That make bad choices. Yeah. And I think once I was able to come to that realization, that was good for me, because it gave me hope. It gave me hope that I could somehow, some way turn this around.
What separated you from the addiction?
That's it. Right. That's the hard thing. That was even hard for me. It's hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around that. Separating the person from the addiction. Yeah. And once I was able to do that, I was able to believe in myself again. And that's the first step. I mean, there was so much more that has come since then. All of the work that I'm 8 years in recovery now. It's not there's no quick fix, right?
Nope. No, there's definitely no quick fix.
And when you, and this is universal in life. When you break that bond of trust, like I did with my wife and family, that's fragile. And to get that, it's really difficult to kind of bring that back together.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it really is. And how long before you yourself knew and understood the extent of your addiction? Like the actual monetary number that you had, that the addiction rather had taken you to.
That's a great question. One of the things, while I was in treatment, and this was a gambling specific treatment facility, and it was intense. One of the things the professionals do in there is they sat down with me, and we went over all of that. We went over all the numbers, and I was blown away because I had no idea. I was in such a cloud. I was so foggy for the last few years of my addiction. I had no idea. Money to me was not, it was just, I mean, I had no concept of the value of a dollar. It was just stuff. So, but we sat down and went over it, and it was over $1 million. I was over $1 million in debt, loans, all of it. And we had lost our home to foreclosure. All of these things that I had to go through and sort through, and it was over $1 million. And I had no idea how I was ever going to repay that.
Yeah.
It was shocking.
Oh, absolutely.
But what would happen? So after that, I came home on March 7th of 2015 from treatment. And on March 27th, so 3 weeks after that, I had to go in for my sentencing for these theft charges that I was
right.
Faced with, that were actually, I was charged with 2 years prior to that. But that takes a while to play out, that whole process. But that I would go in on March 27th for my sentencing, and I went in there and speaking with my attorney, thinking, okay, well, you just came out of treatment. The judge may view that favorably, and you don't have any prior criminal history.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the judge will put you in a program or something like that. You won't have to go to jail. That was our thinking going in. And then I walked into the courtroom, and I'm looking around, and they do what's called victim impact statements at these sentencing hearings. And what that is the people that you have harmed are there to tell their side of the story in front of the judge. And I had nobody there to speak on my behalf, but I'm looking around this courtroom, and I see a handful of people that were former clients of mine that had waited for this day for years. And they were eager to tell their side of the story. And I don't blame them. I mean, they had every right to. And again, they didn't care at that point why I did what I did. They were just pissed, and they wanted to tell the world about it, and they did. And so the judge sent me off to jail that day for 4 months, and with a suspended sentence on top of that. So I had to go to jail, and then I got out. And then if I didn't screw up, I would never have to go back to jail. But part of that too was restitution. I was ordered to pay all of this money back.
Yeah.
And so that was, as I'm walking out of jail, would have been June 13th of 2015. I had this sense of freedom about me that I hadn't experienced in a long time. And it wasn't freedom from jail. It was freedom from addiction. Right.
Yeah.
My mind was clear. I just felt great, but I was terrified too, because I didn't know, one, if I'd ever get a good job again. Right.
Yeah.
And make the kind of money I needed to make to pay all this back. And even if I did, if I'm paying all this money back, over $1 million, how am I going to contribute to how is this all going to work? I mean, so I just had no idea, but I remember telling myself, somehow, some way you'll do it. And I didn't know how that was going to happen, but it was a great feeling walking out of there.
Well, absolutely. I can imagine. And I think part of it, and it doesn't always happen, so I think it's really important that we let the audience know you were committed to paying them back and making things right. And that is really the only way you can truly break that addiction.
Yeah, that's well said. You know, I just made a commitment to I made a commitment one to my recovery.
Yeah.
And if I go back to my time in jail real quick, something happened. It was interesting in there. I there was a guy to the bunk on the bunk to the left of me. He was there for the first few months of my stay in jail, and he was a heroin addict. And we would talk every night before lights out. And he leaned on me for a while. On he I told him my story. He told me his story. He and his wife had been living on the streets. They lost their kids, and he kept telling me all he wanted was to get into treatment and get his life back so that he can get his kids back. And in talking with him for a couple months, we developed a bond. And then he left about a month before me from jail. And he told me on his way out how much of a difference it made in his life talking to me, because I gave him hope in sharing my story and my outlook and where I wanted to go after everything I had done.
Yes.
He gained hope from that. And that triggers something in me. I'm like, you know what? I've spent the last 15 years of my life taking from people. Maybe I have the ability to help and give back. And, you know, that's an amazing feeling to somebody that has gone over to the dark side and did the things I did to feed my addiction. And so walking out of jail, that was my, my inspiration. You know, I knew somehow, some way, if I just changed my outlook and changed my thinking and went out of my way to make a difference in this world, something good would come from it.
Oh, that's excellent. It's so wonderful, not just to hear it, but to see it in your face, to see it in your body language, that for one, you're totally free of the addiction, but more than that, you're dedicated to helping others. And sometimes we have to wallow in it to be able to understand it enough to be useful to others when we come through it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You know, I wouldn't be the person I am today if I didn't go through what I went through. And there's just no way. I'm a much better father. I'm a much better husband. I'm a much better friend. I'm a much better person all around because of what I went through. I wouldn't wish that upon anybody, but at the same time, what I do now is I try and give people hope that are struggling with, whether it's gambling addiction or whatever it is, mental health. You can get through it if you just take the steps and seek help and talk to people about your issues and don't keep it in and don't isolate like I did. You know, there are resources, there are people in this world that will help you, you know. And so, but in the moment, like we talked about earlier, when you're in the darkness, it's really hard to see that. So, my purpose in life now is it's totally changed. It's traveling the country and meeting with, you know, young people, predominantly student athletes and that sort of thing, and explaining to them what can happen if you lose focus and you lose control and you're susceptible to addiction. And these are the dangers out there. Okay. And coming from somebody that's lived it, I was smart. I got good grades. I had everything going for me, and I lost control. And this is what happened. And so, to be able to share that experience with people and engage with them, young people, and it's great when they ask questions at the end of these presentations that I do, because it shows me that I'm actually resonating with them, and they're in tune with what I'm trying to tell them.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I believe, to do the best good, you really have to have been there. because you can't understand the bottom of the barrel till you've sat there. And there's lots of people that can help others and that do, but not with the wholehearted, full-bodied commitment that a former addict or a former suicidal individual or a former, put whatever tag you want there. But until somebody has lived it, you really can't pass on the hope. And that's the one word I think that's critical, because we have to understand that no one is an island. And the longer you maintain you as a singular unit, the harder it will be for you to ever break out of any addiction or issue.
That's it exactly. I mean, to find hope and to see a little bit of a sliver of light when you're in that dark tunnel, and I think we're better in society now at recognizing it and addressing some of these things, but we're still not nearly where we need to be. But I was afraid to talk to anybody. I was scared. I was ashamed, all of it, and so. If we can just open up to people and talk to friends, family members, or even if it's a stranger, like there are numbers you can call and talk to professionals that can help you steer you in the right direction for help. Because that's such a huge thing. The word hope is that's the single word I clung to when I was in jail. Is I just, if I can just find hope somehow, and my wife gave that to me in brief conversations on the jail phone. When I'm calling my wife, she would say something that gave me a little bit of hope that maybe I had a chance to get my marriage back and put that family back. It's small things. If we can find hope, that's a motivator.
Yeah.
But when you don't, if you can't find, if there's no hope and you can't see the light, that's a scary place to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, we have to give a shout out to your wife. Wow.
Yeah, she's the true hero of this story for sure. She I'm fortunate because it doesn't, the majority of the time it doesn't work out that way, But what she did was she wanted to understand what this was, what gambling addiction actually is, instead of just cutting the cord and sending me off, which she had every right to do. She wanted to understand what this was. And she got to a point where she was able to, like you said earlier, separate the addiction from me.
Yeah.
And that's such a huge part of this.
And it also speaks to how you can be effective in what you do now to help others because of her belief in you, not the addiction.
Absolutely. And that's, it's just, that's such a huge piece to this that people just can't quite wrap their head around. Is the addiction is not that doesn't necessarily define who the person is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
My wife married me because she knew me as a good person, not knowing that she was also marrying somebody who had a full blown addiction. But if you can separate the two and learn about addiction, learn what it does to the brain, that's a big part of this.
Yeah, well, my hat's off to her, and I have to give a nod to your father-in-law too, to love his daughter enough to take that chance for her and reach out to you. That's not every in-law would do that.
No, and they were incredible. My wife's family, her sister, her parents, they all basically took on a role. My wife's mother basically raised our son for a year while my wife was trying to sort through all this, and I wasn't. I was in jail and everything else, and my father-in-law took care of the finances and did all of that. And they, they shelled out thousands and thousands of dollars to basically get my wife back on her feet again while I sat in jail. And to any father-in-law, and I have since paid most of that back, and we'll have them paid back here very shortly. But any father-in-law to allow the son-in-law back into his house
Yeah.
after doing that to his daughter and grandson, boy, I don't know. I don't know many that would, but they have welcomed me back into their family, and have been great during this whole time. I mean, they were not happy, to say the least, but
No.
and it's taken time to rebuild that trust.
Yeah.
But we're in a good place, and there's a lot of we are a family now again.
Yeah. And I think what's really great is every time you speak, every time you go out to help young student athletes, you're giving back to them in a different way. For everyone you reach out to, that's another little splash in that cup of hope that you are now passing around, which I just think is incredible.
Yeah, and it's like you said earlier, it's different, to get in front of a group of 100 or 200 or 300 student athletes and tell a story without lecturing, right? I'm not there to tell them what they should or shouldn't do, but I'm telling them from somebody that's gone through it and lived it, and that's different than standing up as just like a medical professional,
Yeah.
and telling them about the research and the statistics, and which are all relevant, but at the same time, it resonates more with them to hear it from somebody that's, like you said, that's gone through it.
Oh, absolutely. It's a little off topic, but I firmly believe that a medical professional or a police person or anyone who has to deal with humanity at their very lowest needs to have spent time in those trenches in order to understand just how dark and horrid it can be there. Because you cannot bring empathy if you've never understood any of it.
No, that's for sure. And it's just, life is really, it's all about experiences, right? And what we go through and what we learn from that, and how we carry that forward, and what we do with the knowledge that we've gained through these experiences. And yeah, I mean, I can't tell you, it's I've learned a lot, as we all do through everything that we go through in life. We're all constantly learning and growing.
But not everybody takes the lesson. That's the difference. You were given these lessons, you were brought to your knees, but you chose to reach up for hope. You made that choice.
I did, and I learned early on in treatment that 80% of gambling addicts eventually go back to it, right? So I was already fighting an uphill battle with, just sheer numbers. We don't, most of us don't get to this point, but I didn't know that I was going to get to this point at all. I just knew that where I didn't want to go back to where I came from. And so I was just going to keep pushing forward, and whatever happened. But, it's again, you mentioned it's hope. If you can find hope, the guy next to me in jail was able to find some hope in our conversations. I was able to find hope, talking with my wife from a jail phone for a couple minutes a night. That carried the day for me. I found hope, and there was nothing was going to shake me.
It's such an incredibly uplifting story. I am sorry for all the trials that you went through and that your family went through, and you now have 2 children.
So now we have a second son who's 5 years old now, who wouldn't even be on this earth if not for my recovery. Okay. So that's the whole other side of this, and I don't take that for granted, not for 1 second of one day. I look at him and I feel blessed, blessed that we're able to have him in our life. And my oldest son has a brother, younger brother now that he's able to play with and goof around with. And it's the greatest thing. So very fortunate that my wife stuck with me, very
Yeah.
fortunate that I had family that looked after me and gave me an opportunity to turn my life around, because a lot of people don't have that. They don't get that opportunity. And some of us, all we need is an opportunity to turn things around and
Yes.
the hope. And I was able to, I found that and I held on tight to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're very glad that you did, Patrick. Absolutely. So if you can leave our audience with one one tip or one, I hate the word hack, but one life hack or tweak that you use on a regular basis that you think might be useful for the audience, what would that be?
If there's any takeaway from this, for the main thing is to reach out for help, whatever it is. If you're struggling with mental health, your suicidal thoughts, addiction, a lot of these things are kind of intertwined. But depression, the worst thing you can do is to keep that to yourself and isolate. The best thing you can do for your own well-being is to talk to somebody about it, whether that's a therapist, a friend. And that's what I tell people. If you think you're struggling, you are, and you're going to need some help.
Yes.
And don't be ashamed. Don't live in the darkness. Don't isolate. Be upfront. Talk to some people about it. And if you're afraid, if you're afraid to talk to or embarrassed to talk to somebody that's close to you, call somebody. Call the suicide prevention line, Gamblers Anonymous, NA, AA. There are a lot of different organizations and groups that you can reach out to. Go to a meeting. Because one of the things I found early on was that I thought I was the only one doing
Yeah.
this and acting this way. And when I was able to surround myself with people like me, that was huge, because it made me. I came to the realization that, okay, I'm not alone. There are other people that are struggling with this, and if you can get around people like that, they can understand you. So that's the main thing I want to get across is, don't be afraid to reach out to people for help if you think you need it.
Yeah, don't struggle alone. Absolutely. That is the best bit of information, the best bit of advice anybody could give anybody. And I love what you said there. If you are struggling, if you believe you're struggling, you are. And so reach out. And even if you reach out and it doesn't go too far, at least you've reached out. You've gone to touch another human being. You've spoken to another human being, because you're absolutely right. That darkness, that lockdown of self is, I think, the worst thing we can do for not just ourselves, but for other people. Because until you know that others are walking the same walk as you, then we won't ever be able to fix anything. And we won't look outside ourselves where maybe we could be helping another.
Yeah, that's it. The worst thing we can do is isolate. Isolation is not, it's not constructive. It's not helping.
No.
And we all need to get past the shame that comes with all of this, with mental
Yes.
health and addiction. Don't be ashamed of where you're at. Just be open and talk to somebody, because there are compassionate, caring people in this world that will that will help you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Patrick, I thank you so much for coming on and being our guest and being so raw and real, which to me is absolutely the best thing anybody can be. I'm Elaine Lindsay. This is Suicide Zen Forgiveness. And until I see you next time, make the very best of your today, every day. I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe on your favorite service. Suicide Zen Forgiveness was brought to you by Truel Social Media, the digital integration specialists. Let them get you on page 1 in the search results.
And also by Canada's keynote humorist, Judy Croon, the motivational speaker, comedian, author, and stand-up coach at Second City.